Welcome everyone to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the Suboden Khan from the White Scars. Lovely model, quite complex as well. There's a lot of detail on this model. I create two sub-assemblies, so I've got the actual Khan stuck to one little base, and then I've got the jet bike on the other. Both have been primed. You can still see the primer is still drying. Both have been primed with Vallejo black primer through the airbrush, but you can use a spray can for that. The Vallejo primer, it's got a slightly glossy finish to it. If you wanted a more matte black finish, you could use the Army Painter's matte black through the airbrush or through spray can. Use a Fengda Airbrush. Just also remember, on the sub-assemblies, GW have left his feet on the bike part of the model. So to get to white, we start with grey. The grey, the Basalt Grey from Vallejo, will be our darkest colour. So what I do is, anything that I want to be white, I just use the airbrush really and just pretty much base coat all of the white areas with the Basalt Grey. I leave a few areas in shadow, but this is generally 100% coverage. There's very little that we leave with the original black. And I also do this on the Khan model as well. So where you want to be white, just use the Basalt Grey. Basalt Grey is a very thick paint. It does need quite a lot of watering down. And then just a few short sub sprays with the airbrush gets us a good coverage. If we want to go dark a bit later on, then we can just apply washes. So just getting a good coverage here. When I'm base coating the actual Khan model, I'm almost doing it as a zenithal highlight, making sure that the areas that I want to be quite bright white, or as bright as I want to go, are got a bit more coverage with the Basalt Grey. And just remembering that even though in a minute we're going to be using some white ink, when we apply our edge highlights, that's when we really get a nice pure whiteness to the model. So in reality, we only apply pure white through the brush is when we're edge highlighting, but we still get a nice white effect. Obviously, if you want to go brighter, you just add more white to the model, decrease your shaded areas and shadow areas, and increase your white areas. But with this guy flying around the battlefield, I imagine him a little bit grimy. The White Scars, I don't imagine to have pure white armour. Once we're happy with the coverage, we then move over to some white, And like I mentioned, I'm using a white ink. I'm using the Liquitex White Ink, but you could use the Vallejo White Ink, the Green Stuff World White Ink. I always just add a little bit of water to it just to thin it down a little bit, but not too much. And then, like we did with the Basalt Greys, is through the airbrush very carefully, very short sharp bursts here, too much and the paint will spider web. And what I want to do is apply the white on the areas that would catch the light the most. So this is almost, if you do it with the airbrush angled like I am, you'll get that zenithal highlight happening. The bike itself, I just pick out all the areas that I want to have to be white, which is most of the body area really of the bike. You can add as much or as little as this as you want. We can always shade it back a little bit. If you add a bit too much, you can go back over it with the Basalt Grey through the airbrush just to help blend it in. So once you've got it as white as you want to get it, just let it dry for a little bit, and then just go back to it. I've found it's not that it dries brighter, it actually dries a bit duller. So just to go back and have a look at how it looks like the model to the bike, and then once you're happy, I then give everything that's the whole model and the Khan through the airbrush a coating of the AK matte varnish. Any matte varnish is fine. I just find what it will do is it will blend everything together. It will protect the layers because there'll be a lot of handling of the model, and it just flattens it down. The white ink could be quite glossy, but that just flattens it down. So the next step we've got is quite a long step, and this is going to be edge highlighting. I'm edge highlighting with AK Intense White. So the idea here is now we're introducing our pure white through the brush. So on the bike, it's all the edges that you want that are white. Just go around and edge highlight, pick out any rivets. This is where I also add like battle damage. So on some of the edge highlighting, I make it thicker, adding like bullet holes and marks where the paint has been chipped off. One handy little thing you can do is try and make some of the scrapes at the front of the bike horizontal, as if like the stuff is pinging off as if it's going around at high speed. If you don't want to add the battle damage, then just do your highlighting as normal. But I find the battle damage just adds a bit more texture and that to the model. Makes it look like it's my one. I wanted it to look like it's been on the battlefield for many years, getting beaten up, not enough time to fix it. As you can see, I'm moving the model, trying to keep my brush in the same sort of position, keeping the paint, not as much paint on the brush, because this is quite an intense colour. Even though we're going over white, where it's come through the airbrush, we're now adding quite a lot of intensity. So yeah, just angle the model, angle the brush to try and get into those nooks and crannies and some of those weird angles. This is quite handy to edge highlight because there are a lot of sharp points and angles on it. So once I've done that, I now just want to base coat in the red at the front of the bike and the two sort of I suppose it actually looks like a little bit like a kid's drawing of a Christmas tree. That's what it always reminds me of, but it's the two sort of half triangles from the box art. So all I do here is base coat in all of the red with AK Black Red. You could use like a Mephiston Red from Warhammer, or if you wanted to go darker, you could use like a Corn Red. But the Black Red is just a good base to get the red going. A couple of coats is needed. Just remembering to paint that front edge as well. So just work around the model, just painting in this front part. Now, when it comes to the freehand for the angles, I just mark on there a couple of dots where I want the angle to go down to, and then paint a line down to that. I don't try and do the line as straight away. I just mark on the model where I want the line to end, and then work the paint down to that point. So it just gives you a reference point to go to, and I just follow the box art from that. And then it's just a case of base coating it again in the black red. I then just use some good old Nuln Oil just to give a good wash over the black red. Not at this point over the model itself, just the black red part, just to get some definition around the trim that's there and in that little ridge hole line that's there as well. So once I've done that, I then want to just, whilst I've got the Nuln Oil out, I just want to apply some of it across the Khan model and the bike. Now what I do is, in the little lid there that comes with the Nuln Oil, I've put some Nuln Oil in there and applied a few drops of water as well, so it becomes really watery. You could just do that in the pot itself, but I just do it in that little lid part because it just saves getting out the extra bit of equipment. And what I'm doing now is I'm just applying this Nuln Oil all over the miniature, just so it defines some of the shapes, tones the white down a little bit, and gets into those recesses. So this is a watered down Nuln Oil wash. It's probably a 70-30 mix in favour of water to Nuln Oil. If you've done it and it doesn't look enough, then just apply another layer over the top. It's better to have it watered down more so you can apply more layers than it being too dense and you've almost ruined it and have to start again. I then apply this on the bike itself, but all I'm doing here is just picking out some of the rivet holes, glazing it into some of the deeper shadows, and just defining some shapes that are in and around the model. It does take a little bit of time to dry, that wash, because it is quite wet. So now we're just moving back to the red, just to brighten it back up now. So I've gone back to the black red, and all I'm doing here is just I'm relayering where that Nuln Oil has dried it, has knocked it back a bit. So I've watered the black red down a little bit, and now I'm just pushing the paint down to where I want it brighter, so that where you remove the brush is where the most paint is left, so that when you're glazing the paint on, you're naturally leaving it a little bit brighter towards the front. And yeah, sorry, it's not the black red. What I'm using here is Ionic Red, which is a lovely, really intense red colour, just with a little bit of water. But you could use Evil Sun Scarlet here, which is a nice red. So if you've gone Mephiston Red, you could go Evil Sun Scarlet. If you've gone Corn Red, then you may have to go Mephiston Red into Evil Suns. But this black red and then Ionic Red over the top gives a nice muted but bright red. It's an odd way. I wanted it to look quite dark still. I didn't want a nice bright red. I wanted a dark red. So having it watered down and glazing it is a good way of doing that. And don't worry about going any of those areas of the trim there. We'll be painting that back to black in a little bit. This is just to lay down the coverage for the red. Now I'm just going to be applying an edge highlight on the red, and for that I'm using some Cadian Fleshtone. So all I do here, a bit like we highlighted the edge highlights for the white, all I'm doing here is working my way around the front edge, just applying a nice edge highlight with the Cadian Fleshtone, and then a little bit like we did, adding some scratches, some scrapes, some bullet marks, just to give some damage to the front of the vehicle. Now we're going to be doing some colouring in. So all the battle damage that we've done, the white and the red, I'm now going to be painting inside of that with Rhinox hide from Warhammer. You could use a black. I just wanted to use a Rhinox hide instead of a black, just to give the bike a bit more different colours here and there. So all I do here is I do a sort of scratchy edge highlight, a little bit thinner than the white we laid down, and then I just go around, and wherever I've added scrapes and scratches and bullet marks, just paint the inside of those areas with the Rhinox hide, leaving the highlight colour around it so that it looks like the actual damage has got a little highlight next to it where the sunlight is glinting off. Takes a bit of time depending on how much battle damage you've done, but it's a worthwhile exercise just to give a bit more life to our damage. Once that is done, I then take a bit of time, get some Army Painter's matte black, and I just go over everything now and just bring it back to a standard black finish. So anything that we've covered with the white inks and stuff, just cleaning all that area up now, just to bring it all back to a uniform colour. So now we're going to be painting some of the metallics. For this we're starting with the golds, and I'm base coating all of the golds with AK Rusty Gold. So there's some iconography on the front, some framing around some of the front of the bike, the exhaust covers, a few bits and bobs around. I just paint in, base coated with AK Rusty Gold. Obviously take your time here, don't want to damage any of that red that we've done or any of the white. So the next metallic will be silver, and for that I'm using AK Gunmetal. I'm applying this with a dry brush, being a bit reckless because of all the other work that we've done, but I'm using a relatively small dry brush from the Artify range. I'm just taking care now just to dry brush over all the areas I want to be metallic, which is quite a lot of the bike. It's those sort of refractor bits at the front there, his foot stands, the sort of intake guard at the front, the exhaust pipes at the front and the exhaust pipes at the back as well. Just paint those in your metallic. Obviously you could use a lead boucher. You could do this via brush if you wanted to and then go over it with Nuln Oil. I just did the dry brushing because I've got a little bit of control here, and I like the gunmetal finish and the sort of dirty finish you get with dry brushing metallics straight over black. I then just finish off in the areas I couldn't get with a dry brush, just with some brush work. There's only a couple of bits just on that sort of frame on the back of his seat there. It was hard to get to with a dry brush. So next up is his shield. So I base coat all of his shield with the AK bronze tin. So now to add a little bit of shade and depth. So all of the gold I give a wash in the Reikland Flesh shade. Not too much on the brush, but enough that it moves into those recesses. We also apply it to the shield just to get some depth into those recesses, so that when we apply our layer over the top, you get some nice brights and some nice darks. So now I'm going to highlight the gold, and for that I'm using AK Old Gold, which would be Retributor armor if you're using the Warhammer paints. So just apply this over any of the raised areas, anywhere where you want the sunlight to be catching, any rivets that are sticking out. When I come to do the exhausts, you'll see that I sort of move the paint towards the top curve. So that's where I want the light to be glinting, is on that top curve. So I just almost glaze the paint into those top parts, just to create not an edge highlight, but a long streak of highlight, as if the sun's glinting off the top of it. Again, take your time here. I'm using a size 0 brush from Raphael, the 8404 range. Has a nice tip on it, nice point. And yeah, just picking out the top parts of those iconographies, edge highlighting areas around, and just putting some stark highlights on the exhaust areas. To highlight the shield, I use Sycorax bronze, and much like the gold highlight, I just now work around picking out all the bright points. It's really all the raised areas and all the bits of iconography I pick out with a Sycorax bronze. I then get some natural steel, which is a very bright silver, add that to the wet palette and just mix it in with the Sycorax bronze just to give a nice bright, almost desaturated glint type highlight. And now I just apply this over some of the edges where I want it to be really bright, just where I'd imagine it to be catching the light, and just paint those in this sort of desaturated highlight colour just to show that the sunlight is glinting off the top of them. You can then use the natural steel to highlight your gold. So there are, bright Citadel paints for this, but any just bright silver. On the gold areas, just very small highlights in the middle of where you've done your original highlight. Not too much, because too many highlights and it's not a highlight. Just small dots and little edge highlights here and there, just to make it look like the gold is reflecting back the sunlight so much that it's turned almost a white gold. So moving along, it's quite a lot to do still, but we're getting there. I'm going to be doing the leather and any sort of skulls, but it's mostly leather I think on this one. So I base coat all the leather in grim brown. I then do a first layer of leather brown, then a second highlight layer of saddle brown, and a final edge highlight of Cadian Fleshtone. So the leather is relatively straightforward, there's not too much. It says it's gun on one side, a little bit on the side here I'm painting that's holding the heads. There's also his seat. So for the leather, for his seat I do it slightly differently, but for the normal leather, that's a grim brown base coat. I then cover about 90% of that in the leather brown. I then with the saddle brown do some edge highlighting and add some scrapes and marks. And then the Cadian Fleshtone is just a final edge highlight and maybe picking out a little bit of detail here and there. For the actual seat, I use just the grim brown and the leather brown, maybe do a little bit of saddle brown, quite watered down, and almost wash the seat in those colours. So he's sat on most of it, you don't really see it, but I want there to be a hint of like the leather brown there, so I just apply it in sort of thin glazes just to get a sort of dirty mottled look, but it's still base coat in grim brown with some leather brown over the top. And then finally, which I'm not sure I capture on camera, there's some little sort of rivets on the leather seat. Just pick those out in either your gold or your silver, but the leather there's not too much, it's relatively straightforward. Just remember to be using the saddle brown and the Cadian Fleshtone as your main highlights and the colours that you can apply some damage with as well. So there we go, that's the leather done. Just going to move on to the couple of parchments that he's got, and I'm just using that's AK Light Earth and then AK Deck Tan. Just they're very light bone type colours. So I just base coat in the light earth, and then I just go over picking out the highlights, any of those raised areas with the Deck Tan. So for the couple of deadheads, I give it a couple of coats of AK Sickly Pink. This has become one of my favourite colours really. It's so good as a base for faces. It works with loads of wash colours as well and gives lots of different looks from just one colour. But yeah, you will need a couple of coats as it is quite thin, so thin it down a little bit to maintain the detail, and yeah, paint your heads in AK Sickly Pink. So for the wash, I'm using Warhammer Vulpus Pink, very intense colour. So I apply a couple of little splodges of it, and then dip my paint in some clear water. Dip my brush in some clear water, and then apply that over the top of the paint. So it waters the paint down on the model to give this nice sort of pinkish, sicky type wash. If you've put too much water on it, don't worry, just let it dry and then apply another layer of Vulpus Pink. It's always good to have it more watered down than you generally need to, because you can always apply a second layer. Once that Vulpus Pink has dried, it takes a good 10-15 minutes. To make it go a little bit green, I'm just using some Athonian Camo shade from Warhammer and just applying that as a wash over the faces, so it turns them slightly green and adds some more definitions into the shadows and recesses of the faces. Again, leave that a good 10-15 minutes to dry. To highlight them, I'm just going back to some Sickly Pink and just doing some light highlights of the faces, ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth, just to bring it back. If you wanted to go brighter, you could just apply a little bit of white to it to get a brighter highlight. But I find the sickly pink over the top is enough highlights. We did dull them down quite heavily with the washes. You'll also notice there that some of the items are red as well. So like the little fur tufts, some little strands that are around the bike are painted red. Those are just done in the same colour. So that's a black red base with a Ionic Red highlight. Okay, we're now going to apply some heat effect to the model. That's on the rear exhausts and the front air intake. And from that, what I've got there is a pot of ready-made, it's Vallejo white ink. So 1 part white ink, 1 part water, and 1 part contrast medium. I've just made a big vat of it so it's easier. And what I'm doing here is I'm painting it into the little recess intake lines that are on the front of the bike. Just to fill them up with a nice pure white. Basically what we're creating here is like a white contrast paint, so the paint will pool in into any of those recesses. So this is going to be the start of our sort of glowing effects, and when we're using fluorescents, especially through the airbrush, having a white base really helps make those fluorescents shine. And letting this dry, again, a good 10-15 minutes just to let this dry. And so whilst it's actually drying, here I'm just adding some intensity to the bottom, but we're going to be airbrushing it in a minute with some white ink anyway, so it's not necessary. So whilst it's drying, we're going to be adding some green glow to the screen that's on the front. So for a base coat, I'm using AK Greenskin, which is it's a dark green, but it's got a lot of pigment to it, so it's quite a pure green colour. It's a little bit like Caliban green or Warpstone glow, I think. And then we then have got a highlight with AK Frog Green. We then apply some white and then some fluorescent green over the top, but just to get the base of the green screen using the AK Greenskin Flesh as your base coat. Oddly, this paint does take a while to dry. I'm not quite sure, I might have a duff pot, but mine does take a while to dry. So this is where we're going to be moving around the model, just getting lots of work done. I'm using AK Violet Red and AK Magenta and AK Intense Pink for the waxes. So you base coat in the magenta and then just do subtle highlights with the intense pink. So back to the green screen, and what I'm using here is AK Frog Green, which is Moot Green from the Warhammer range, and I apply an edge highlight on the top left and an edge highlight on the bottom right corners and a couple of little squiggly lines in the middle. Once that's dry, I then grab some AK Intense White and just do a little white highlight inside of those frog green highlights. And then once that's dry, I apply some AK Fluorescent Green paint all over just to get a subtle green glowing green screen. And then continuing on with some of our glowing effects. So this is all being done whilst that white ink is drying. We haven't skipped anything here. So to get some red glowing effects, first off I use some AK Wine Red as a base coat. So there's a little gem on the shield and there's two red lights just at the sort of middle part of the bike. Base coat those in AK Wine Red. Then with the AK Blood Red, I apply a couple of little highlights where I want them to be glowing. So on the gem is a sort of dot in the middle and a little circle, so it's a dot in the top corner and a semicircle at the bottom of the gem. And on the lights it's relatively the same, so it's a dot in the top corner and a thick semicircle in the bottom corner. I then apply a couple of dots of white and then go over all of it with our Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red to give a sort of glowing light effect. And so now our white ink mix is pretty much dry, so I'm going back to the Liquitex White Ink, and I'm going to be just doing some overspray effects. So I'm aiming the nozzle down towards that bottom edge, and then a little bit on the left and the right edges, just so that we've got a little bit of overspray with the white ink. Helps blend it in a little bit, so you can see where we've got that intense glow there in the center part. And I do sort of the same with these reverse nozzles, but I just do a couple of sprays inside of it so that we get a little bit of overspray on the inside of those exhaust vents. So now we're moving to adding the fluorescent. So I'm using the AK Fluorescent Orange. Through the airbrush, a little bit of water in there just to water it down, and now it's just a simple case of anything that was white there, just cover it with this fluorescent orange. A couple of coats is needed here, short sharp bursts with the airbrush, and just cover it. You notice that I also covered the top part of the gun just so it's got some glowing coming from it. But the idea here is cover everything with this fluorescent orange. Okay, to tone it down a bit and to make it look like it's like hot, I now apply some fluorescent red from Green Stuff World, and I try and do this in the top corners, so leaving the bottom part orange and just a little bit on the gun. So just where it's cooling down, I apply this fluorescent red, and the same with the vents on the back, just a couple of squirts. As you can see, I had some fluorescent orange still left in the gun, and now I'm just heavily spraying that through just to get this red coming back out. Now what I'm going to do, the final stage for this, is I'm just going to dry brush over those areas with a little bit of gunmetal just to get some of the metallics back, and then very gently over the top of those with some AK Tenebrous Grey just to add some sort of smoky darkness where the glowing effect can't penetrate, because it's, that's sort of in the shadow of the areas. So this just helps refine the shapes and add a bit of texture and definition to it. Again, they're just making sure that the paint has dried before applying, because the fluorescents do take a little bit of time to dry. So to really get that orange to pop at the front, this is an optional part of it. You don't really need to use this, but I'm going to just apply some enamel paint to it, which is the AK Wargame Liquid Pigment Orange Fleur. It is really intense, and you only need a very, very small bit on the model because it dries even brighter. And all I do is I just in the lid there is some of the paint. I apply a drop of odorless thinner into it, give it a mix, and then just with a brush just apply this to the bottom part of the vents just to get a really pure orange glow coming from it. It is optional. If you wanted to add this and you didn't have this paint, then what you can do is apply a little bit of that white ink wash that we made, and then over the top of that add a little bit of the fluorescent orange. You could even add a little bit of fluorescent yellow if you wanted to, but I wanted to keep the intake looking a bit dirty and dark, and I didn't want to go too bright. And with that, the bulk of the bike is done. It's pretty much finished. So what I wanted to do was just show you how I did my basing. So what I've got here is a dirty down water soluble rust paint, and this works by you apply it to the model straight out of the pot, and then if you apply some water to it, you start to get what looks like a naturally occurring water rust effect. So I'm applying this quite heavily to the base, and then I water it down quite heavily on the brush and apply it just to the bottom areas of the model, so it looks like the model has been flying through this grimy wasteland. So whatever you do to base your model, if you use like any browns or acrylics like that, water them down and apply them as washes to the sort of bottom edges of the vehicle, so then it looks like it's been flying through it and doesn't stand out too much in the model. Again, that is optional, you don't have to do it, but I find it just helps blend the model to the base. Sometimes they can look quite separate from each other, whereas if you say wash some of the model in the colours that you've used on your bases, then you get that effect quite easily. So the final part is now the Khan himself. Now for this guy, we're pretty much using all the same colours that we've used on the bike. So any of the reds, we start off with AK Black Red and then move up to the Ionic Red. I then apply some washes with some purple colours, but the primary colours are the same. The golds are rusty golds highlighted with old gold. The armour is highlighted with the intense white and the battle damage done in the same way. The parchments are all done the same way. The leather is all done the same way. So yeah, a lot of the work that all the colours that are on the bike are now going to be on the model, which then helps blend the two together. The longest part here really is the cloak, and for this it's got some really odd shapes. It was quite a tricky cloak to paint, but your primary part here is just base coating it in the black red just to get a defined red at first, and then we can apply our highlights. So to get our red to stand out a little bit once everything's base coated is where I want it to be bright red highlight, I apply a layer of AK Intense White over the top of it. So this is also on the iconography because I want that to be quite bright red. So really I do edge highlighting and thick layers of white where I want to, when I apply my red, I'll get a natural gradient effect where the red, so if you paint a line of red, you paint either side and that line itself, so you overlap, so that you get an intense red in the middle and then a faded out red effect where it's just going over the black red. It's a good way of getting some natural sort of gradients happening in an easy way instead of using an airbrush all the time, that you can get a similar effect. Many painters have sort of started doing it. We've been doing it for a very long time just to get some real colour pop, especially on edge highlighting. So if you did an edge highlight in white and then went over it in your bright colour, it's an even brighter edge highlight than it would be if you just went over the colour without the white. So it is a little bit thinned down just to get a little bit of translucency, but the idea here is to imagine you're using red to get a highlight, but you're just using white. So once it's done, I then get the Ionic Red again with a little bit watered down, not too much, and now I apply it all over the edge highlight and all over the areas that we've painted as white, making sure that we overlap into the black red a little bit so that we get a nice transition from the black red into the white. Don't worry if it looks garish, we can apply some glazes and washes in a minute just to help with the blending. So here I've got some Druchii Violet, the Warhammer wash, and what I'm doing with a small brush is I'm just going to apply this now as our shade. So very subtly it gives the model it gives the robe a slight purplish look, but not too much. And this is basically being used now instead of like a Nuln Oil, which you could use if you wanted to, you could just go straight for Nuln Oil. But I'm using this just to add just some different colours of shadow onto the model so it's not always black. Almost glazing this into the areas, remembering that rule that wherever we leave the brush, that's where the most paint is going to be left. So I'm almost glazing this now into the shadows. You can add multiple layers of this to help with the blending. Take your time, remember to leave it between each layer just to dry, and it will help blend in those edges. And over the course of the next few minutes, what I'm doing is now I'm adding in another darker layer of Tenebrous Grey. Again, this is a wash of Tenebrous Grey, so heavily watered down, and I'm only applying this in the deepest recessed areas and into those deepest shadow areas. Not too much of this, you need to heavily water it down, otherwise you can apply too much of this and it's a very intense colour. So over the next few minutes I'll be just going around doing glazes of Tenebrous Grey and then making glazes of the Ionic Red, just to intensify the colours from darkness to the light. So making a glaze, you just add, if it's 1 drop of paint, you would add 3-4 drops of water, so that if you applied it onto your nail, it's extremely translucent. I will do a separate video on making the glazes, but it's trial and error. It takes a little bit of practice, but just remember to water your paint down more than you think you should, because you can always apply multiple layers. Remember that the paint dries darker when it's on the model, so don't worry if it looks too bright. That's just the light reflecting off the water that's in the mix. And this is where you can help define some shapes and some shadows, pushing the paint into those recesses so that you get some good bright points and dark points. You can see that I've already highlighted and sort of base coated and highlighted the gold areas and did the wash with Reikland Flesh Shade like we did on the bike. I then apply some highlights just to those gold areas with old gold and natural steel, exactly like we did on the bike. For his hair and the handle, the shaft on his spear, I base coated in black, and then I make a mix of AK Tenebrous Grey and white, 50-50 mix, and just do some edge highlighting on his hair, just to make it just look like a sort of purplish grey highlight. So he's slowly coming together, just a few more bits left to do. So for his flesh, I base coat it in AK Dark Flesh. Needs a couple of coats as it's going over a dark colour. I then use good old Rhinox Flesh Shade as the first wash, just to start getting that definition. I actually apply 2 layers of Rhinox Flesh Shade, and then I go back to the dark flesh just to start relayering in the paint, just to bring it back up. I then use a light skin tone, much like a Kislev Flesh or even a Flayed One Flesh, just to pick out the highlights on his face, which is his nose, his ears, the mouth, the cheekbones. So I don't want it too bright, I want to keep his skin rather dark. For he's got a little bit of hair on the top there and a bit of a mustache. I just picked that out in a Tenebrous Grey colour, but you could use black or a dark brown. But with the face, obviously a small brush. I'm still using the size 0 brush, but you could use a 00. Put some paint on the brush, get it to a nice sharp point, and then brace your hands and just take your time, just applying that paint. So you thin the paint down a little bit as well. You'll notice there that I went around whilst that Rhinox Flesh Shade was drying. I went and painted the leather of the gloves and the cloak, but we painted those exactly the same way that we applied the leather on the rest of the bike. Again, trying to maintain the connections between the model, the Khan, and the bike that he's on, in having the same colours throughout the miniature. the final stages now, guys. We're almost there. So I'm just going to be painting the spear. We will be using the airbrush, but first of all, what I'm going to be doing is I'm edge highlighting the entire spear with AK Intense White, picking out the little power node and the little nodule at the top, and then also with some slightly thinned down white paint, applying some lightning streaks, which are just jaggedy lines. It's nothing fancy. And then apply some striation lines at the front of the blade, just to get some intense striping going on, that when I apply the ink through the airbrush in a minute, it grows to be quite an intense colour. Back to the airbrush, and what I'm doing here is just aiming the airbrush to the center of where I want it to be nice and bright. A couple of sprays just so that we get some natural gradients of the intenseness. So where the more white paint is, that will be where the most the color will show through when we're applying our contrast paint through it. And the contrast paint we will use will be the Warhammer Frostheart blue, which is a nice colour to use to get like a blue plasma-y lightning sword or lightning axe effect. And all you do very carefully, just apply this over all of the white that we've just applied. we're going straight back to the white, and it's just a thin edge highlight, making sure that you just go over the areas there that you want to be nice and bright. You can even make a few more of your lightning streak marks, and if you thin the white down quite heavily into a glaze, you can glaze it into the central points of the spear towards the tip there, just to get a final glowing effect of the spear. So quite quickly we've got a nice looking power spear, I guess you would have. So having the white watered down a little bit helps it flow off the brush. Okay, we're now just going to be adding some final glowing effects to his backpack. So for that, we're going to be using our glowing red colours again. So we've got AK Wine Red, AK Blood Red, and some Fluorescent Red and Fluorescent Orange. So what I'm doing here is the Wine Red is added into the vents at the top. So anything that you want to be red and glowing, just base coat it with the Wine Red. I then add a little bit of over the Wine Red. We then add the Fluorescent Red straight over, and then in the corners where I want it to be brighter, I add a little bit of AK Fluorescent Orange. just at the final edges, just to make it look like it's heavily glowing. And then the final stage is to stick him onto his bike, which took a little bit of manoeuvring. It wasn't the easiest one to do. Use a little bit of super glue to glue his feet down. And there he is. So probably in total it's probably about 2.5 hours work using the airbrush. So not a lot for a character model with a lot of detail, but as you saw, this tutorial was almost in real time for you. Only a few stages were trimmed down, otherwise they get a bit boring. So yeah, I really hope you've liked this tutorial. Thanks for subscribing, it's really appreciated. There'll be many more tutorials to follow. Reach out, share images of what you've managed to create. Doesn't have to be just this model, any model you've got. If you've got any thing you'd like me to do, then just give me a shout and I'll see if I can fit that into the schedule. So yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.